a lot of people sort of argue that the methodology sort of drove the change, but my reading of the literature is just the opposite. It's really the policymakers and the researchers that asked for the change, and the methodologists came up with ways in which to sort of expand the knowledge of the time and to develop new procedures that would allow policymakers to get the kinds of information and to answer the kinds of questions that they were asking. So I would say the growth and expansion that we saw was really in response to policymakers and researchers wanting to know more, asking more challenging questions, and creating both the need and the opportunity for what I would call methodological and technological developments. So that the 80s marked this period, I think. So if you look back to the 80s, from the 80s until now, you'll see that the number of assessments have grown, the number of organizations doing assessments has grown, the number of participating countries has grown, the populations who are surveyed has grown, what we're able to measure has changed and grown, the methodology has changed somewhat, and we're now able to test both in paper and in computer. So these are both ways in which the field has expanded and grown. It's also created new challenges that I think methodologists are now beginning to address. And as we talk a little bit more this morning, we'll sort of talk about ways in which that's going to expand. So this is sort of a summary of large-scale international surveys. If you look at the school-based, Pearls and Timms has been around the longest, I think. PISA is a more recent, I guess, a newcomer to the school-based surveys, but in many respects has kind of grown to be larger, at least in a political sense, than Pearls and Timms. At least it's that way in the US, and I suspect elsewhere. On the adult side, in the 90s, IALS was the first international adult literacy survey. It was done by the Statistics Canada in conjunction with the OECD. It was followed in 2003 by ALL, and then in 2012 by PIAC. And then the thing called STEP that's in a little black dotted box. A couple years ago, the World Bank went to the OECD and said, you know, we're running this large program looking at attachment to the workforce. So this is run by a group of economists who are interested in looking at data related to skills, education, and workforce participation. They came to the OECD and said, we'd like to somehow be able to link our results to PIAC. Is there a way you can help us? So the OECD contacted us and said, can you do something with them that if they followed all the rules, they would be able to compare their results to PIAC. So we went and talked to the World Bank and agreed that we would build them a paper version, a paper and pencil version of PIAC. And we gave them a set of standards that was a subset of the standards that you had to do for PIAC. And when I come here, they tell me that they suffered doing PIAC because we had so many rules and regulations. So anyway, the World Bank in a number of countries, in developing countries, are doing something that if they succeed, they will be able to be on the literacy scale from PIAC, and so they'll be able to connect their data to some of the PIAC data. I put it here only to say that I think that's the direction in which development banks and other organizations are going. I think the view now is that skills are as or more important than credentials. So when you look at anybody, if you look at any national sample and you look at a grade, any one grade, you see quite a bit of variation in the skills that people acquire for any year of schooling. And that goes all the way up to as high as you can go. So lifelong learning and skills have taken on increased importance over just credentials. And I think the development banks are interested in skills, not just in whether or not people have gone to school. And so I think the kinds of large-scale assessments that we're talking about and the kinds that you're involved with are going to continue to grow in both importance and in size. So in a perfect world, you know, the curriculum, what kids see in schools, would match pretty much to life skills. That is, what we teach would be what we need in order to function in the world. And what we measure would be connected to what we teach and to what we function in the world. Unfortunately, this realistic view, this idealistic view is not the realistic view. In the real world, you sort of have life skills, curriculum, and measurement. So curriculums typically measure a part of what we need to function outside of the school context, but not all of what we need. And so a lot of things go unmeasured. And I would say in the early days of IEA and NAEP and TIMSS and PEARLS, they're tied very much to the curriculum. So the measurement is, those large-scale assessments sit pretty much inside the curriculum. By design, TIMSS and PEARLS is trying to measure what it was or what it is that kids learn in schools and how well schools have delivered that information. I think the adult assessments and PISA have sort of changed that. In IALS and ALL and in PIAC, the focus has been on what it is adults, young adults, older adults have to do with skills in order to function in their daily lives. So they have, by design, moved outside of the curriculum, both in the methodology in terms of the kinds of texts and the kinds of information that we're seeking, but also in terms of the measurement and what kinds of information we're getting. And I think PISA, when it was designed back in the late 1990s, it was designed to be different from IEA in a systematic way. And one of the ways is to move away from being linked to curriculum. If you read the early literature in PISA, the reason that they tie reading, math, and science to literacy is because literacy, the connotation of the word literacy, is really outside of a school context. It's being able to function in everyday life. And I think PISA, when you see it, PISA talks about the yield of schooling rather than the curriculum. And I was chair of the reading literacy group from the first cycle, and so we were told by design that the focus was not to be on what gets taught inside of schools, but really on the kinds of texts and the kinds of uses of text that students needed to be able to do once they left school. So it was really looking at the transition either to further education or to the workplace. So we've seen a real shift, I think, in some of the large-scale assessments. So let me talk a little bit about some of the features of large-scale assessments. So as I've been saying from the beginning of this lecture, is one way in which large-scale assessments differ from individual tests are individual tests have to be designed to be reliable and valid at the individual level. Large-scale assessments are not designed to be reliable and valid at the individual level. They're designed to be reliable at the group level. So we give up some of the measurement precision at the individual level for the group level, and that allows us to introduce different methodology, like bib spiraling, and other things that have been shown over the years to be quite reliable, quite valid at that level, even though they're not appropriate for individuals. If you were going to look at individual scores, you'd have to use a slightly different methodology. So large-scale assessments have really grown because their focus is on providing information that can inform policymakers and researchers and some other stakeholders. And so they differ from individual tests in key ways. And that's important because when you look at the methodological kinds of issues, the methodology is somewhat different, the designs are somewhat different, and the things that get done are different. These are some features of large-scale assessments. Whether you look at PISA, whether you look at TIMSS or PEARLS, PIAC, or any other, they all have sort of this kind of features. They all start with extensive frameworks. They involve sampling not just of students or adults, but also of items. The items really represent a population that represents the construct, not just the items on the test. They involve weighting. They all use now very complex designs, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking to you about the designs because I think it's important to understand them. They all now use IRT-based modeling. A lot of them now use what's called population modeling. So when you actually get data from PISA or PIAC, you're not getting scores, you're getting what's called plausible values. And those plausible values are derived from a Bayesian model that takes the IRT parameters and the population models, which come from mostly the background information, to derive what's called a distribution of plausible values, and then you take a random sample of that. So it's a very complex methodology, differs greatly from what you do from individual testing, makes it much more complex to analyze, but gives you a lot of efficiency from a design point of view to be able to deal with the questions that come up. And they're all connected to background. So the background models and the background variables have become increasingly important over the years because of the information they provide to policymakers. Policymakers are no longer interested solely in the distribution of skills. They want to know how those skills are connected to a whole range and a growing range of background characteristics. And in fact, the background variables are now starting to use, in many cases, scales and IRT-based models, not just individual variables. And as we're going to argue, there's an increasing reliance on computer-based assessments. So I would say until very recently, all large-scale assessments have been done in paper-based only, with some optional computer-based assessments. So if you think back to PISA, in 2006, PISA introduced a little bit computer option for science. That was extended a little bit in 2009 for reading, and then in 2012 for mathematical literacy. But it was basically a paper-based assessment. If a country wanted to do an optional computer-based module, they could. In science and reading, those computer-based modules were not part of the science or math scale. They just sort of hung out there as a separate estimate of skill. In 2012, PIAC was the first large-scale assessment that I'm aware of that designed and developed the assessment for computer-based with an option for paper-based. And in 2015, PISA will also use computers as the primary mode of delivery, with paper as an optional mode of delivery. And so I want to spend the rest of the time sort of talking to you about some of what that meant. So the reason that computers, I think, are going to be of growing importance, and the reason that they were used in PIAC and will be used in PISA for 2015, is they better reflect the ways in which students and adults actually access, use, and communicate information. So you can't go to an expert group anymore or talk to policymakers and say to them, you know, we can continue to just do paper-based because we can measure everything we need. Nobody believes that anymore. If you go to the reading expert groups, they'll tell you that kids spend more time using technology to access and communicate information than they do print. And so computers have become a dominant way in which people use and access information and communicate information. And so it's hard to say that you could build a valid assessment if you weren't building it and delivering it on a computer. One of the reasons it's good is because it broadens what you're able to measure. We were able to extend the construct of reading in 2009 and in PIAC by building it onto the computer. We could extend reading to include digital text, to include web-based environments. We could introduce new constructs. In PIAC, we introduced a construct called problem solving in technology-rich environments. In PISA, they're introducing science is going to be extended to include investigation and being able to do scientific inquiry that could best be done on the computer through these scenario-based tasks. And they're also introducing collaborative problem solving. So these are constructs that you really couldn't do in a paper-based environment. So you can really change the nature of what you're able to measure. You can make the tasks more interesting, more relevant to students and adults. And I think the computer allows you to take advantage of both operational and measurement efficiencies. We believe in PIAC that the amount of data we got, the quantity and the quality of the data, are significantly improved over what we get in paper-based assessments. So in my view, this is the future. I don't think we'll ever go back to just doing paper-based. I think paper-based will be sort of in a transition mode until everyone catches up.